Hi, I'm Matt Joyner, and this is part 2 of our 5-part series on Demystifying Your Deal, a series of videos to help you understand the process of buying or selling a business. In our first video, we talked about the preliminaries. Here in this second video, we'll talk about 3 points with regard to the purchase agreement. First, the basic alternative structures of the agreement. Second, the agreement from the buyer's perspective. And third, the perspective of the seller. The purchase agreement will be structured one of 2 ways. It'll either be a sale of assets or a sale of equity. Typically, a purchaser wants to purchase assets. That way, they don't get unknown liabilities along with what they're buying. Frequently, a seller will like to sell the equity. Now, sometimes the reason for an equity deal is if the business has contracts that can't be transferred or licenses that can't be transferred, and that will cause a purchaser to do an equity deal. But otherwise, the purchaser wants to do an asset deal. One other issue with regard to the purchase agreement is whether it'll be what we call a delayed close or whether it'll be a sign and close deal. A delayed close is when the parties sign an agreement agreeing that they will actually close the deal at a later date and the money change hands and the title of the assets change hands at a later date. A sign and close deal is when all of the documents get signed and the money changes hands all at the same time. And there are different scenarios that are appropriate for a delayed close deal and a sign and close deal. Okay, let's talk about the purchase agreement from the buyer's perspective. The point of the diligence process from the buyer's perspective is to learn about the business, to smoke out whether there are any hidden liabilities in the business or any hidden liens on the assets that they're purchasing, such as judgments, tax liens, or other encumbrances on the assets. Thus, a few of the items important to the buyer in a purchase agreement are the description of the assets themselves, to make sure that everything that is included in the deal is actually included on paper. Conversely, that means you want to outline any assets of the business that are not included in the deal, specifically excluded. That helps clear up any misunderstandings later on or avoid any misunderstandings later on. Another issue that the buyer is particularly concerned with is a description of the liabilities of the business and whether or not the purchaser is taking any of those liabilities and which ones of those liabilities specifically the purchaser is not assuming and will be taken care of at closing by the seller, typically out of the proceeds. One thing that can reassure the buyer that there are no hidden liens on the assets being purchased is a tax certificate or tax letter from the state taxing authority stating that the seller has no outstanding unpaid taxes. This can take some time to get out of the state tax bureaucracy, so it's something that the seller has to start in to obtain early on in the process. But once they do, that's great assurance for the purchaser that there aren't any hidden state tax liens on these assets and that they don't risk the tax man coming and taking these assets that they thought they purchased. Now, one thing from the buyer's perspective that the purchase agreement needs to cover is the issue of items that are not absolutely fixed at the time of closing. The amount of working capital in the business, the value of the inventory. The purchase agreement will contain provisions of truing up those values, sometimes after the deal, in order to arrive at an accurate purchase price. Now let's talk about the purchase agreement from the seller's perspective. Whereas the buyer is most intent upon making sure they get what they pay for and not get something that they don't want, the seller is mostly concerned with getting paid. From the seller's perspective, some of the important provisions of the purchase agreement are how the purchase price is going to be paid, how much will be in cash, will there be a promissory note from the purchaser if there's any seller financing, will there be an escrow of funds to be paid later, or will there be an earn-out to be paid later to the seller as the business performs overtime after the closing that can increase the compensation to the seller? One of the aspects of the purchase agreement really of equal importance to both the buyer and the seller is the issue of representations and warranties. the seller's making representations and warranties or assurances to essentially give the buyer an insurance policy that this deal is what the buyer thinks it is and they're getting what they're paying for. There are no taxes outstanding due. The assets are in good shape. The seller has actual title to the assets and can transfer it. The buyer wants a very thorough set of representations and warranties from the seller. And likewise, the seller needs to be very careful with regard to the reps and warranties that they give to the buyer, because they will be held to those statements of fact after the deal. So here in the second part of our 5-part series on demystification of your deal, we've looked at the purchase agreement, the structure, whether it's asset agreement or equity agreement, whether it's delayed closing or a sign and close. We've looked at the purchase agreement from the buyer's perspective. We've looked at the purchase agreement from the seller's perspective. Next up, in the third segment, we'll take a look at issues with regard to the seller after the closing. I'm Matt Joyner. Thanks for watching.
If you need legal advice for your business in North Carolina, call Matt, send him an email, or connect with him on LinkedIn.